It is the blistering, unforgiving summer of 1943, and the brutal campaign for the island of Sicily is pushing the United States Army to its absolute physical and mental limits. General George S. Patton, the most feared, dynamic, and brilliant field commander the Allied forces have ever produced, is standing at the absolute pinnacle of his military career. His heavily armored columns have just torn through the rigid enemy defenses with a terrifying speed that has shocked the world. He is a national hero, a living legend in his own time, carrying his iconic ivory-handled revolvers and wearing a polished helmet that gleams under the Mediterranean sun. But in the blink of an eye, in a single catastrophic moment of uncontrollable rage, this legendary general is going to completely derail his own career. He is not going to be brought down by a German bullet, a tactical blunder, or an enemy ambush. He is going to be brought down by his own hand, striking the face of an unarmed, weeping American boy inside a hospital tent. Before we dive into this controversy that sidelined the Allies' best general, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button if you love deep dives into World War II history. This story divides people even today. So as we go through it, let me know where you stand. Type Patton for tough discipline or anger for abuse of power. Let's explore the raw truth. To truly understand what happened in those sweltering medical tents, you have to understand the specific psychological universe that men of that era operated within. The men fighting in World War II, the young boys we now revere as the greatest generation, were subjected to horrors that are genuinely difficult for us to comprehend today. But the military establishment of the 1940s did not have a modern understanding of mental health. Today we understand post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as a severe, legitimate medical injury caused by the horrific trauma of combat. Back then it was called shell shock, or battle fatigue. And for old-school, hardened cavalrymen like General George S. Patton, it simply did not exist. To Patton, a man who believed in reincarnation and destiny, courage was a choice and fear was a disease. According to his own published diaries, Patton firmly believed that if you allowed a man to surrender to fear, that fear would spread through the ranks like a deadly virus, infecting the brave men who were actually holding the line. He believed it was his sworn duty as a commander to literally shame the fear out of his troops. But where does the line exist between tough love and outright tyranny? I want you to think about that as we look at the facts. If you think a commander has to sometimes be ruthless to save the lives of his men, type yes in the comments right now. The first incident occurred on the 3rd of August, 1943. The Sicilian heat was suffocating as General Patton arrived at the 15th Evacuation Hospital to visit the wounded. It was a routine morale visit. Patton walked past rows of cots holding young men with horrific physical injuries, missing limbs, severe shrapnel wounds, and terrible burns. He spoke to them gently, kneeling by their beds, sometimes with tears in his own eyes, thanking them for their sacrifice. But then he came across a young man sitting on a box near the receiving tent. His name was Private Charles H. Cool, a 26-year-old soldier from the 26th Infantry Regiment. Private Cool had no visible physical wounds. Patton walked up to him, his boots clicking on the floorboards, looking down at the young soldier, and asked him where he was hurt. Private Cool looked up at the intimidating general and replied, "I guess I can't take it." The atmosphere in the tent instantly froze. Patton's face flushed bright red with fury. To him, this was the ultimate betrayal of the men lying in the cots nearby. Without hesitation, Patton cursed at the young man, slapped him across the face with his gloves, grabbed him by the collar, and physically shoved him out of the tent, screaming that he would not have cowardly bastards hanging around his brave, wounded boys. He ordered the medical staff to send Cool straight back to the front lines. What Patton did not know, and what he did not care to ask, was that Private Charles Cool was suffering from chronic dysentery and a severe case of malaria. His body temperature was over 102 degrees. He was legitimately physically sick. But Patton's blinding rage did not allow for medical nuance. Was Patton justified in trying to snap a soldier out of what he thought was cowardice, or was this a complete failure of leadership? Type right or type wrong in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know how you view this first encounter. If the incident with Private Cool was a spark, what happened exactly 1 week later was a massive explosion that would shake the entire Allied High Command. It was August 10th, 1943, and Patton was visiting the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. The smell of ether, sweat, and blood hung heavy in the air. Patton was walking through the receiving tent when he saw another young soldier sitting on a cot, fully dressed, shivering and crying uncontrollably. This was Private Paul G. Bennett of the 13th Field Artillery Brigade. Unlike Private Cool, Bennett was not a rookie. He was a seasoned combat veteran who had been fighting relentlessly on the front lines, his nerves completely shattered by days of constant, deafening artillery fire and the loss of his friends. He was suffering from severe, undeniable shell shock. Patton approached Bennett and asked him what his problem was. Bennett, sobbing, looked at the general and said, "It's my nerves, sir. I can't stand the shelling anymore." Upon hearing those words, something inside General George S. Patton completely snapped. He lost total control of his emotions. Patton leaned over the weeping soldier and began screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing through the silent, shocked hospital ward. He called Private Bennett a yellow coward. He called him a disgrace to the uniform. And then, Patton raised his hand and violently slapped Private Bennett across the face, not once but twice. The second slap was so hard it knocked the soldier's helmet liner right off his head and sent it rolling across the floor. But Patton was not finished. He reached down to the ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his waist, yelling that he ought to shoot Bennett himself right there on the spot. He screamed at the medical officers, demanding that this crying coward be sent back to the front lines immediately to die like a man, rather than hide in a hospital. Did Patton completely lose his grip on reality in this moment? Did the pressure of command finally break his own mind? Type anger in the comments if you believe Patton had crossed a line from which he could never return. The doctors and nurses standing in that tent were absolutely horrified. They had dedicated their lives to healing these broken boys, and here was a commanding general physically assaulting a vulnerable patient in their care. According to the meticulously detailed historical records and the official reports written by the medical staff, specifically Lieutenant Colonel Perrin H. Long, the doctors decided they could not stay silent. They drafted a comprehensive report detailing Patton's shocking behavior, outlining the assault, the verbal abuse, and the threat of deadly violence. This highly explosive report was sent directly up the chain of command, eventually landing on the desk of General Omar Bradley. Now, General Omar Bradley was a quiet, methodical, and deeply respected man, known as the GI's general because of his immense care for the common soldier. Bradley was utterly appalled by what he read. But Bradley was also acutely aware of a very dark, practical reality. He knew that Patton, despite his massive flaws and his dangerous temper, was the most effective combat general they had. The Germans feared Patton more than any other Allied commander. Bradley faced an agonizing dilemma. Does he destroy the career of the Army's best fighter to protect the dignity of 2 enlisted men? Or does he bury the report for the greater good of winning the war against fascism? Bradley initially chose the latter. He locked the report in his personal safe, hoping the incident would quietly fade away. I want you to pause and really put yourself in General Bradley's shoes for a moment. You are fighting a war for the survival of the free world. Do you protect your best general, or do you stand up for the common soldier no matter the cost? If you understand Bradley's decision, type cover-up in the comments. If you think the truth should always come out immediately, type expose. But secrets of that magnitude rarely stay buried forever in a democratic army. Word of the slapping incidents began to leak out through the medical corps, eventually reaching the ears of the press. Drew Pearson, a highly influential and controversial radio broadcaster back in the United States, got hold of the story and broadcast it to the entire American public. The reaction back home was immediate and explosive. Mothers and fathers across America who had sent their young sons across the ocean to fight were completely outraged. Members of Congress demanded that Patton be fired immediately, stripped of his rank, and sent home in absolute disgrace. The pressure was monumental, and the crisis finally landed squarely on the shoulders of the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. According to Eisenhower's own personal files and wartime correspondence, the decision regarding what to do with his old friend George Patton was one of the most agonizing of his entire military career. Eisenhower despised what Patton had done. He considered the physical abuse of a subordinate to be an unforgivable offense. But Eisenhower was also a brilliant strategist who knew that the upcoming invasion of Europe, the massive operation we now know as D-Day, would require a commander with Patton's unique, aggressive genius. Eisenhower wrote a blistering, deeply personal letter to Patton, tearing him apart for his lack of self-control, his terrible judgment, and his failure as a leader of men. He gave Patton a private reprimand that was so severe it left the proud cavalryman shaken to his core. But Eisenhower knew a private letter was not enough. The punishment had to fit the crime, and the punishment Eisenhower devised was a stroke of psychological genius, though it was profoundly devastating to Patton. Eisenhower ordered General George S. Patton to personally apologize to Private Charles Kuhl, to personally apologize to Private Paul Bennett, to apologize to the medical staff he had insulted, and most crushingly of all, to travel from unit to unit across the entire Third Army and publicly apologize to the tens of thousands of men under his command. Try to imagine the sheer crushing weight of that humiliation for a man like Patton. He was an aristocrat, a proud, fiercely arrogant warrior who believed he was destined for historic greatness. And now he was being forced to stand on wooden boxes in front of vast crowds of regular enlisted men, swallowing his massive pride, and publicly admitting that he had been wrong. He stood before his troops, his voice sometimes catching, and delivered his apologies, trying to explain that his actions had come from a place of loving his men so much that he couldn't stand to see them act like cowards. The reactions of the soldiers were mixed. Many of the hardened combat veterans actually cheered for Patton, telling him they understood, begging him not to apologize because they knew he was the man who could lead them to victory. But others stood in cold, bitter silence, viewing him as a bully who had finally been put in his place. Do you think this public humiliation was the right punishment for a general of Patton's stature? Was it enough to balance the scales of justice? Tell me what you think in the comments, because this is where the history becomes incredibly complex. But the true cost of Patton's anger did not end with the apologies. The strategic fallout was enormous, and it altered the trajectory of the war in Europe. Because of the public outrage and the loss of trust from the high command, Eisenhower simply could not give Patton the leading role in the upcoming invasion of Normandy. When the time came to select the ground commander for the greatest amphibious invasion in human history, Eisenhower chose the steady, reliable General Omar Bradley instead. Patton, the man who had spent his entire life studying war, preparing for a moment exactly like D-Day, was benched. He was sidelined, forced to sit in England and watch from the sidelines while other men led the charge onto the beaches of France. The military high command did use Patton's terrifying reputation to their advantage, setting him up as the commander of a fake phantom army, the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, to deceive the Germans into thinking the invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. The deception worked brilliantly, precisely because the German high command could not fathom that the Americans would sideline their best general over a simple matter of slapping a soldier. In the harsh, brutal calculus of the German military mind, striking a subordinate was nothing compared to winning battles. But the Americans were different, and Patton had to pay the ultimate price for failing to understand the democratic nature of the army he led. He was eventually brought back into the fight, leading his Third Army in a spectacular dash across France and playing a vital role in rescuing the trapped forces at the Battle of the Bulge. But the shadow of those slaps in Sicily followed him for the rest of his life. It is a profound, tragic irony that a man of such immense courage, a man who possessed an unparalleled genius for destroying the enemy, was nearly destroyed himself by his inability to conquer his own inner demons. This story forces us to look in the mirror and ask very difficult questions about leadership, morality, and the horrific realities of war. We look back at these men, these giants of history, and we want them to be perfect heroes, but they were deeply flawed human beings operating under unimaginable, crushing pressure. Patton was a man of a different century, fighting a modern war with an ancient warrior's mindset. He genuinely believed that by slapping those boys, he was saving their souls and saving the lives of the men fighting on the line. He could not comprehend a wound that did not bleed. But his ignorance of trauma does not excuse his cruelty. As we wrap up this deep dive into one of the most fascinating controversies of the 20th century, I want to leave you with one final question to ponder, and I want you to give me your most honest, thoughtful answer in the comments below. If you were sitting in the chair of the Supreme Allied Commander, if you were General Dwight D. Eisenhower holding the fate of the free world in your hands, and you had all the facts in front of you, what would you have done? Would you have forgiven General George S. Patton because the world desperately needed his brilliance to defeat the Nazis? Or would you have fired him on the spot because the fundamental dignity of the American soldier must be protected at all costs? Type your verdict in the comments. Let me know if you stand with the need for ruthless victory or the need for absolute justice. If you found this journey into the unvarnished truth of history valuable, please make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like on the video, and share this with someone who appreciates the real, complex stories of our past. Thank you for staying with me. Thank you for honoring the history, and I will see you in the next deep dive.